Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's event on U.S.-Canadian Defense Industrial Cooperation. And we're pleased to provide you with what I think will be a really interesting discussion on this topic, and also to point you to our recently released report of the same name, glossy, pretty. You really need to have one of these right away, and also as a Christmas gift for your loved ones. But before getting into the substance, let me start with our usual security announcement, which is to let you know that in the unlikely event that something were to happen and we were need to leave the facility and leave this room as a result of a disturbance, I would be your security officer, and I would give you further instructions, and we would hear instructions from the voice of God telling us what we needed to do, and I would guide you in the proper direction, either out the way you came in or out the back. But I think I've done this announcement, I don't know how many times. It's never happened. That's the good news. And I don't expect it to be the case today. I also want to begin today's event by thanking the Canadian Commercial Corporation, because they sponsored our study and really allowed us to dig into this topic, which has proven to be a really interesting one. I'm going to give a few opening remarks based off the findings of our study, to give you kind of a taste of it and whet your appetite for more. And then I'm going to turn to our excellent panelists to go deeper on the topic. But so what is the U.S.-Canadian Defense Industrial Partnership? It's a 70-year arrangement between the two countries, growing out of the experience of World War II, where there was quite a bit of industrial collaboration that happened in support of the Allied war effort, and which both sides saw the utility in continuing after the war, and particularly in the face of the growth of the NATO alliance and the Cold War construct that necessitated the close partnership between the U.S. and Canada, which is kind of exemplified by NORAD and the common air defense of North America. And the industrial relationship really followed in on and supported that broader security relationship. And in fact, it also reflected an economic partnership between the countries, which is longstanding. There's a tremendous volume of cross-border trade between the U.S. and Canada in general, in all categories, and that is also true in the defense sector. And the defense sector is a complementary aspect to that broader economic relationship. The partnership survived the end of the Cold War. It seems obvious, but it's worth saying that the U.S. and Canada are still neighbors. They still share one of the longest land borders in the world. And so the highest priority U.S. national security missions, Homeland Defense, and a number of other ones, inescapably involve partnering with Canada to achieve U.S. national security objectives, such as securing the borders, maritime security, maritime interests, defending U.S. airspace, North American airspace, mutual interests in the Arctic, which is a growing area of potential cooperation, protecting critical infrastructure, much of which crosses the border, and a host of other priorities. And one of the interesting findings of our study is just how significant the industrial relationship between the U.S. and Canada has been in terms of surge industrial capacity. And that was demonstrated clearly during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In the years from 2000 to 2011, the amount of cross-border contracts from the U.S. to Canada to acquire defense goods actually doubled in general, and briefly tripled in 1 year, reflecting the fact that when the U.S. needed extra industrial capacity, particularly in up-armoring vehicles and support of land forces, Canada was able to assist in that effort and did so very, very rapidly, providing that surge capacity. The annual average, long-run average, is about $1 billion of U.S. contracts prime contracts going to Canadian firms, and then, as I mentioned, that doubled and then very briefly tripled in that time frame. But the data also shows that there are probably some barriers and some market distortions that are shaping the cross-border defense trade that we at least need to be aware of and think about whether those are things that we want to do something about in this relationship. One that stood out is that unlike most U.S. contracting, where there's a rough balance between goods and services, about 50-50 from a rough order estimate, In the U.S.-Canada trade, it's 86% on the products side. So depending on your perspective, we are either not availing ourselves, so some of the services that Canadian industry has to offer, or we've successfully defended ourselves from their efforts to infiltrate our market. But in any case, that is a notable difference between the cross-border trade and normal defense contracting universe. The other thing that stands out is that on the R&D side, the contract work going to Canadian firms is all very much on the early stage side of the business, and there's very little in the later stages of research and development, and there are probably good reasons for that. They merit some further investigation. But to actually talk about the value of the relationship, what some of these areas where we should explore, maybe deepening the relationship or addressing concerns that either of the two sides might have in this defense trade arrangement, and then the opportunities for it going forward, I want to start that conversation with our panel. And I will briefly introduce them before recognizing them for some opening comments. To my left, affiliate, non-resident affiliate here at CSIS, the former Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition Technology and Logistics, Frank Kendall. My former boss, probably merits disclosing and saying, although I think a lot of people know that. Frank is back out in the private sector, private citizen Frank Kendall, involved in a range of activities, some board membership, some consulting. He is, I think, an expert in residence again at Renaissance Strategic Advisors. Yeah. And involved, again, deeply in the issues of acquisition policy confronting the Department of Defense still. To his left, Martin Zablocki, President and CEO of the Canadian Commercial Corporation. That he assumed that position after serving as the Chief Operating Officer and a variety of other positions at CCC. And to his left, David Drabkin, who is a master of many trades, currently serving as a commissioner on the somewhat blandly titled Section 809 panel. For those of you who don't know, the Section 809 panel is the body stood up by Congress to look at streamlining defense acquisition regulations. And I don't know, David, is there something that could be streamlined in defense acquisition regulations? It's an astonishing assertion, but David is also still involved in industry, former a government official in a number of different positions, particularly in the contracting world, and former director of contracts from Northrop Grumman. And Frank, I would ask you to kind of kick us off with your thoughts on the relationship and its value, and then we'll get going.
Thank you, Andrew. I want to compliment you and CSIS on the report. I think there's a lot of valuable information there and some very strong, good recommendations. The relationship between Canada and the U.S. is very close and very strong for a whole variety of reasons. Both countries, however, have been under some budget pressure, particularly in their militaries, for some time now. And I'm not sure exactly what the situation is in Canada, but in the U.S. there may be some relief to that, but not as much as people would like in some areas. And there's a question then of what the priorities become for the U.S. budget. That's a whole other topic of discussion. But I think there are continuing reasons for close cooperation, particularly in the area of defense acquisition, research and development, acquisition and sustainment, the services that Andrew mentioned. The U.S. for a very long time has been a situation where it really can't afford to do everything itself. It needs to rely on its close friends and allies around the world, including, of course, particularly Canada. Also, I would say that the United Kingdom and Australia are other very close partners we have very strong relationships with. And there needs to be some recognition of the limitations of each of the partners, and then some understanding of each other's strengths so that you can exploit those strengths and work better together. And then I think, as the report points out, there are a number of areas in which obstacles can be removed to enable that relationship to proceed much more easily. I want to comment on a couple of things that I think are kind of top level that are framing, if you will, for this whole conversation. And the first is that not much will happen without political will on both sides, and a political prioritization of deepening and strengthening the relationship at all levels. And quite honestly, I don't mean this to be a political conversation particularly, but there are some suggestions right now, I guess I'll say, that the U.S. is not going in the direction of greater cooperation, greater mutual dependency, which I think is unfortunate because I think we do need to go in that direction. So before you can do a lot about the details, you really have to start with some prioritization of political interest, and I think that's kind of a fundamental overarching thing we need to have. That can come from the leadership in the Department of Defense, it can come from leadership in the White House, it can come in part from the Congress, but that needs to be there. And if you don't have all of those pieces, you at least need to have the Department of Defense moving in the right direction. There also needs to be an overarching business imperative for all parties to work together. I think business will always go where the return is. So if you create a reason for business to do things, it will do what is in its interest, basically. And that's true of U.S. primes, it's true of Canadian firms, it's true of U.S. small businesses and others. If you have that, then you need to have to talk about, and there's always an imperative there that you can exploit if you figure out how to do it. The next question is, what are the details that make it easier or harder to make these ventures successful or attractive? And that's where I think a lot of your focus is. And there's some areas where there's specialization in Canada, which makes sense from their point of view, like work in the Arctic. There are reasons where there's certain defense industry areas where Canada has great capability. I think on the services side, there's the human capital side, which can offer a lot from Canada. You know, very well-educated population with a lot of skill sets that can be brought to bear pretty easily. Then you get into all the mechanisms we put in place, which I think is where your report is pretty strong, Andrew. Talking about the organizations that are in place to oversee this, talking about the export control limitations, some of the very legitimate concerns that all of our partners have about ITAR controls of things that they do and so on. So I think some of your recommendations there are very important. But it all starts with those two imperatives, political will and interest, and then incentives for industry.
All right, thank you very much. Marty?
Okay, thank you, Andrew, and thank you everyone for attending today. As Andrew mentioned earlier, I'm Martin Zablocki. I'm the President and CEO of Canadian Commercial Corporation. And I'm going to guess a few of you don't know what that is, and so I'm going to explain just briefly. CCC, as we call it, is a state-owned enterprise owned by the Government of Canada, and our mandate is really to facilitate trade between Canada and other nations. And we're here today talking about defense, but we actually do that across any sector in the Canadian economy. Really, our focus is on the export side, and what our organization does is we engage in government-to-government contracts that allow foreign governments to buy any good or service from Canada, either from that organization or corporation directly, or they can buy it through CCC. And the value of doing it through our organization is that CCC provides a guarantee of performance, fully backed by the Government of Canada, which significantly reduces the risk to any foreign government buying a product or service from a Canadian company, and provide other incentives in terms of risk management throughout the life of that contract, should governments change, etc. So it's a value proposition that has many legs to it, but that's really the fundamental prime. And we've been doing that, as I mentioned, across a whole broad spectrum of sectors. We do it in clean tech, we do it in infrastructure, we build airports in Ecuador, we do power plants in Africa. But our bread and butter for many, many years has really been the defense sector, particularly here in the US. We are, in Canada, the custodians of an agreement called the Defense Production Sharing Agreement, which was signed between our two countries in 1956. And in practical terms, what that really means is anything that the U.S. Department of Defense buys from any Canadian exporter, they buy through my organization at CCC. And so we know the U.S. DoD very well, we know the policies quite well, and our interest is to try and maintain that door open for the continued collaboration and cooperation that goes on between our two countries in the defense sector. And that's really the interest, Andrew, and thank you to your organization for undertaking this study, in having this study conducted, to really better understand and to allow others to understand the benefits that that relationship brings to not only Canada, but also to the U.S. And so what I would say in terms of the long-standing relationship, I mean, obviously we're geographic neighbors, and Frank explained it well. We've been partners with the U.S. and the closest of allies forever, it seems. There's a tremendous amount of trade that already takes place. And I think people like Frank and others know that there are extraordinary capabilities in Canada that the U.S. can benefit from, but also it should be stated as well, Canada buys the majority of its military products and services from the U.S. So there's a bilateral relationship that occurs there, and it serves both nations very well. I think the other point that the report gets to and speaks a little bit about is really what is the benefit to the U.S. in all of this? Frank talked a lot about how there are certain capabilities in Canada that are unique, and it allows the U.S. to get access to technological capabilities that may not be present here. It's very expensive, as Frank noted, for countries, even with the magnitude of the economy that the U.S. has, to fund all of their military needs these days, and so relying on allies makes a lot of sense. It certainly bolsters interoperability, and of course we've been the closest of allies on a military front for a long time. There's the notion of best value, and I think most of you would know that the Canadian dollar usually sits around 80 cents US, so there's a lot of value from a financial perspective. And then the surge production capability that Andrew referenced earlier around how in times of need, the Canadian economy is geographically close and capable of supplying a lot of the equipment and needs that the U.S. economy has. So I think with that, I'll close on my opening comments and just say, you know, we certainly see a lot of benefit to both sides of the relationship. I think the report sets out very well a lot of the rationale for that, and our interest is to really see that sustained.
Thank you. David?
First of all, Dee Lee, the chair of our Section 809 panel, sends her apologies. She had hoped to join you here today on the panel, but her duties have her out of town, and she asked me to sit in for her, which I'm very glad to do. Anything I share with you today, I also want to make clear the panel has not settled on any recommendations or findings except those that appeared in our interim report. So anything I say to you about what the panel is considering and how that interplays with the report that CSIS has done is my personal opinion and may or may not show up in the final report and recommendations to Congress. I'd like to start out by saying that there are a number of things in this report that resonate with work the Section 809 panel is doing. One of the panel's concerns is the industrial base and whether we have properly spent our time and efforts in identifying the sources in the industrial base, which is no longer a defense industrial base. It's a marketplace of which there's a small core of defense suppliers. But the majority of folks in the marketplace today have very little, if anything, to do with the Defense Department. Suppliers in this regard aren't limited to U.S. U.S. companies. It's a global marketplace in almost every single aspect, and clearly Canadian companies fit into that global marketplace. The question is, how do we make sure that the department has identified its needs and identified the capabilities in that marketplace that can meet its needs when the occasions arise? In that context, we are also looking at the small business program and how it supports the department's mission. And we're considering whether our current goals in the small business program, which if you read in the report, is cited as one of the issues that presents a barrier to some Canadian companies and companies around the world from doing business with the department itself. Currently, that program is measured by the number of dollars which are awarded each year to various categories of small business. They're not measured, the success of that program is not measured by whether it delivers lethality, technical dominance, or supports the maintenance of that technical dominance. Key factors that Secretary Mattis identified in one of his early letters to the department. As part of that small business program, also mentioned in the report, we are looking at the SBIR program. It's a program which most people involved with it think is outstanding, providing tremendous capabilities to the department. But it's a program which has not been funded at a level commensurate with its possible work, and it's a program in which we've been relatively unsuccessful at taking companies from phase 2 to phase 3. These are programs which, by the terms of the program, Canadian companies can't compete, but they certainly might have something to contribute. So while we weren't considering the substance of your recommendation until I read it last night, I can assure you that we will be discussing it. Of course, whatever we discuss, and the panel, if it does agree to it, Congress has to agree in the end. And as you know, one of the third rails, and there are many in government procurement in the United States, is the small business program. Which brings me to the next, really another third rail. We have lots of them, like I said, must be I don't know how we drive trains down them. Domestic sourcing restrictions. And in this context, Buy American, Berry, and a host of others come into our ability to access a global marketplace to meet our needs. And in addition, our president has recently created an emphasis on looking at Buy American, although his initial guidance didn't change how we applied Buy American. It's certainly put a concentration on it, and there's a great deal of education that has to be done normally, but I can tell you that many of our contracting officers and program managers don't understand the special relationship that the Canadian government has with the U.S. government vis-a-vis the Buy American Act. They also don't understand that the Berry Amendment is unforgiving in that regard. And so we are looking at the Berry Amendment restrictions in that context. In my earlier career, I spent 10 years at GSA, and I was there when Katrina occurred, and we were busy responding to Katrina. One of the things we found during that response was, while the United States has incredible resources, there's some things we just don't have ready to ship every day. And we turned to our Canadian cousins because the lines of communication, our ability to move goods and services across the border quickly, supported our efforts in responding to Katrina. And so we're looking at how we discuss and improve through regulation and perhaps through statute our ability to rely on the Canadian marketplace, not just for defense needs, but for general needs. And finally, I'd observe that back in the 90s, when Secretary Perry came to the department and we were facing the peace dividend, we made a decision in the department. That decision was to seek sustainment through the commercial marketplace, not to acquire IP, intellectual property, and we lived with that policy through the end of the 90s. Of course, once 9/11 occurred and we realized what we'd have to deal with in terms of sustainment, things changed. But the intellectual property issue, both how you share it and what's restricted in terms of being shared because of ITAR and DEERS, create barriers not just to Canadian companies but to the global marketplace that ultimately will support our efforts in delivering the lethality and the capabilities that Secretary Mattis has identified he needs, and that Senators McCain and Mr. Thornberry have identified they want the department to have.
All right, thank you. David, I'm going to start the panel off with something that may be a softball or maybe a curveball. You can let me know. But, a couple of you have referenced the debate ongoing in the United States right now about Buy America, America First, kind of a host of issues around that. And I have the deficit of having my formal education training having been in economics. And it strikes me that this really goes back to one of the earliest principles of economics, is whether trade is a zero-sum game or not. And of course, all economics depends upon the idea that it's not zero-sum. And if you kind of go back to the early debates, if it was, we'd still have a worldwide GDP totaling a couple of bushels of wheat and a couple of buckets of water, and we wouldn't have made progress since then. But I'm being a little bit flip. But so central to this debate, it seems to me, is a question of is every dollar that we spend that goes to an overseas company a net loss to U.S. industry, or is there a net benefit to trade, a comparative advantage that generates more value overall than keeping solely to one's knitting and doing everything domestically? And I think I can anticipate a little bit from where the panel, I'm not asking for a yes or no answer on that. I'm really asking you to maybe give us some examples from your direct experience of where this cross-border cooperation actually did or maybe didn't, because I'm open to that response as well, did or didn't generate more net value for the U.S. and its partners than if we had just stuck to our own capabilities solely. In any order that anyone wants to volunteer.
Maybe I'll just, and I'm not an economist, by trade, so I'm not sure I share the same schooling that you do. But you know, one of the fundamentals, at least from my perspective, in terms of how examples I've seen, if you take a product manufactured in Canada, a large platform like a light armored vehicle that General Dynamics would make out of London, Ontario, you have a supply base for that vehicle across both U.S. and Canada of some 800 roughly companies. So a sale out of Canada of those vehicles benefits both countries tremendously. And I think you'll find that plays out globally, of course, in the global supply chains, et cetera. So, you know, anymore today when you look at value through trade, et cetera, you know, Frank referenced it earlier around trying to find where a country is strong, what can they deliver that would be at a premium quality or premium price to provide advantage to the country buying those goods. And quite often it does have an economic impact positively on more than one country when that occurs.
And just, do you want to talk a little bit about the Saudi Arabia deal, Marty?
No, I don't.
You don't? Okay.
I'm mostly an engineer, but I've had a lot of training and I guess some experience in economics. And it's very fundamental that free trade is a net creator of wealth. How many people in the room have taken economics course, Economics 101? Quite a few. I mean, mine was at West Point, but I got an MBA later on. I mean, it's very fundamental that when you expand the economic frontiers to include more participants, and you allow work to go where it's most efficiently performed, that everybody gains from that. That's very basic. And I think the notion that it is a zero-sum game and that somebody has to win, somebody has to lose, is so fundamentally wrong that we have a problem, I think, in our country sometimes educating people about that. And it's really important to our direction on policy. There's no doubt in my mind about this, and I've seen it happen many, many times. So that, for me, is an easy one, although politically it may be a little bit more difficult for some people. I have seen our partners around the world. One of the things that happened to me in my job was that I had not anticipated, I guess, probably I should have, how much international involvement I would have had. But the United States' great strength is its partners around the world, particularly some of its closest partners like Canada. And we benefit enormously. And in the aerospace and defense world, we have a very strong positive balance of trade. I think it's our strongest sector where we have a positive balance of trade. So even if you look at it from that perspective, it's a positive thing. And from the point of view of somebody who has been wrestling with trying to get as much much actual content into our budget as possible for the last several years, anything we can do to be more efficient about that basically allows us to improve national security, or at least reduce the cost of national security. So there's a high benefit there. And if you want to go a little bit further with the economics discussion, resources that go into national security would, in general, from an economics perspective, be better spent producing things that increase the productivity and so on of the larger economy. So there's an argument that can be made there as well. So anyway, you got me going on that one, but I feel very strongly about it.
David?
Well, since everybody told you what they did, I studied philosophy in college. I guess I couldn't do anything else with my philosophy degree but go to law school. So economics has never been my major subject matter area. But I think I look at it, and as we're doing our analysis and trying to figure out how to make positive changes in the processes by which we buy things in the department, is from the perspective of it's countering the threat. And the threat that people are posing, they're not basing their acquisition of the things they use to threaten us based upon a positive economic impact on the economy from which they're buying it. They buy whatever fits their needs from whatever source it is and who can get it to them right away. And part of our challenge in the nature of the technology turn and the new technologies being developed to every government. Part of our challenge is being able to get inside that turn so that either we can counter the threat or at least respond to it. And focusing our attention on artificial barriers to accessing the solutions, things that most of us haven't even thought about, that somebody in his garage, whether it's in Canada or on Silicon Valley, has just developed, and getting it to our operators so they can figure out how to put it into the system to meet those threats, it seems to me to be the thing we ought to focus our attention on. The Department of, I don't want to speak for Mr. Kendall, he was a senior executive in the department, but my observation of the department's mission isn't to improve the economic situation in the United States. It's to make sure we provide an environment where you can have economics that thrive. I think that answers the question. If it doesn't, I should stop.
Well, thank you. And so one of the things that's currently ongoing here on this side of the border is the industrial base review that the administration put out an executive order on. I guess it's been a month or two ago to look at the industrial base. And one of the not directly addressed issues in the executive orders, it talks about the industrial base, but under U.S. statute, the National Technology Industrial Base includes Canada, and so it kind of raises the question of when we look at the industrial base. David, you talked about it's a global marketplace ultimately, and it's really hard to pin down what is the definition of U.S. defense industry. Is that a meaningful phrase anymore? I still use it all the time, so it must have meaning, but I'm also fond of saying it's not as meaningful as it once was to talk about U.S. defense industry, because there's so many different players who may be partially in the defense industry but may not think of themselves as being in the defense industry, and that includes international firms. So as we're looking at the industrial base, acknowledging that we've got this 70-year partnership with Canada on the industrial base, we're even, as a result of congressional action, looking to expand that to include other closely allied countries, the UK and Australia. How do we think through assessing our position in the industrial base? The point of the industrial base review, if you've looked at the executive order, it's really focused, I would say there's a strong tilt towards identifying gaps, weaknesses, single points of failure in the industrial base. But that may look different if we expand our frame to include Canada and Canadian industry, and also if the UK and Australia. So I'd just be interested, Frank, you've done an industrial base review, the S2T2, the last time that this was done. I'd be interested in your thoughts on how to think about the industrial base in this more joint context, if you want.
Yeah, I tend to think about it fairly broadly. As I mentioned, I spent a lot of time with my international partners during the last several years, and got a greater appreciation for the capabilities our partners bring to the table. The U.S. can't afford to do everything itself. It has enormous demands and enormous requirements that it places on the Department of Defense in terms of its missions, its global scope, and what the force structure, which has been reduced, but is still, people would very much like to increase it, can do at the same time that you're keeping all that force operationally ready and current and modernizing it at a rate that keeps us ahead of our peers. So it's a huge undertaking, and we need to rely on our international partners. As I said, the great strength of the United States is the strong network of democracies, largely that are close to us, that share our values, that we have strong commitments for mutual defense with, like Canada, of course, that we can work together with for all of our national security. So I had a tendency to do two things. We're kind of in the expansive side. One was I thought of the industrial base as part of our overall force structure. The military is entirely dependent upon that industrial base to equip it. And with our friends, we generally rely on a privately owned commercial industrial base to sustain our military, equip and sustain our military. So I always, in our budget reviews, ensured that there was a review of the impacts of our budgets on industrial base for that reason. Then you look at beyond that at our international partners and the shared industrial base. We have shared operational capability where our allies are very closely integrated into our forces. And I think we should be thinking about the industrial base in exactly the same way. We talked about the economic reasons for that earlier, but I think there are very good national security reasons for that as well. So it's a little troubling to me to see us potentially going in a direction which is much more Buy American focused. I think that's actually the wrong approach. I think it's the opposite of what we should be doing because of the efficiencies involved, we should be more expansive about how we view the industrial base.
Well, as I mentioned, we are looking at the issue of the industrial base in part because when we've been out talking to companies all over the country, which is part of our mission, we've talked to companies doing all kinds of really neat things who don't know how to reach the Department of Defense, which is really difficult. I'd also suggest to you that at least one of our panel members has made it clear they don't believe there is a defense industrial base anymore. There are a few companies who supply the Department of Defense and without whom they couldn't do its job, but a lot of what we acquire, I mean, look at the supply chains and the companies that supply, they're not typical defense suppliers. They're companies that have very little percentage of their sales that go to it. But our concern is that the industrial base needs, the focus on the industrial base needs to be expanded beyond periodic studies. We need to have active outreach programs to find companies, whether they're Canadian, Australian, British, from wherever they come from. And we also need to provide a point of entry, perhaps even more important. When I was out on the road, I said, well, don't you know about sam.gov? And nobody's giggling. sam.gov is the point of entry for the federal government in order to sell to any agency, including DoD. They didn't even know where to go to sam.gov. We have many different programs. We have something called PTACs in the United States who reach out, who are supposed to reach out to companies to teach them how to access the Department of Defense to sell to them. They don't have an outreach program. They sit there waiting for people to knock on their doors. We have small business programs which are focused right now, as I mentioned earlier, on how many dollars we get, not on delivering mission capability. But we got lots of them spread out all over the country. In fact, we have small business offices now opening outside the country because of a change in the policy about how we manage the small business program. So I think the industrial base, and I think you'll see us talk about this in our report, it needs to have this outreach and this point of entry. We need to be more inclusive. Obviously, there's some things where we need, for security reasons, to provide insight into what people are providing us to make sure that we're not buying something that's a Trojan horse. But outside of that context, the capabilities that exist around the world, if we don't take advantage of them, somebody else will, and then they'll take advantage of us.
Maybe I certainly can't speak eloquently as the two gentlemen beside me on that subject. Other than maybe I'll just underscore the point that David made around, the bilateral relationship really is one of the key avenues to access those types of innovations that may not be present here in the U.S. And I certainly hear and see in a number of countries, but the need to start accessing the commercial market more and not so much reliant on larger defense-oriented organizations. And certainly Canada is rife with those, but I think many of our other allies, you've mentioned Australia and UK as well. So anything that can happen to take barriers away from those kinds of companies participating, I think will help on the technological superiority side as well.
We had a conversation recently where I talked about the need to be precise when we talk about things. I'm going to make that comment about this too. When you talk about the defense industrial base, I think you need to be more precise than that about what you're talking about. Because there are different parts, if you will, or categories in the industrial base. At one end are the major primes who build big weapon systems. And the characteristic of what the U.S. and I think other militaries buy for their forces at the weapon systems end, whether it's a tactical fighter or a surface combatant or submarine or a military satellite, They're very specialized products, and they're very expensive and they're very complicated. And generally speaking, countries pay upfront for the research and development for those products because they are so expensive, particularly on the R&D side, and because it takes so long to get through the R&D process and actually deliver a product. It's a very difficult investment to make. Textron recently went out and built a light tactical fighter on its own nickel as a commercial product, basically. They have not sold one of those airplanes yet, as far as I know. I cannot imagine anybody starting to build an F-22 or an F-35 or a B-21 or you name it on their own, betting on the U.S. government coming along in 10 years or so, or 5 years even, and then buying that product from them. That'd be quite a gamble. I'd have a hard time seeing that get through most boards of directors. So there's that end, right? And they're very sophisticated, specialized products built in small numbers. We do not do volume production of these things on the scale that the commercial world does. So that's a unique set of capabilities. And we have a limited number of capabilities of companies who do that sort of thing. Okay, then there are a zillion small businesses at the other end who do niche products, if you will, that may be embedded in those products. And there's some intermediate tier suppliers. And there was an announcement recently about some merger and activity associated with some of those, more than one. That industrial base writ large has, over time, gotten smaller in terms of the numbers of players in it. And I expressed some concern about that at the prime level, in particular when I was in office. Then outside of that, there's another set of technologies and entrepreneurs and commercial suppliers, ranging from giants like Amazon, for example, Google, et cetera, the big techs, down to the startup in Silicon Valley with a neat new idea for how to do artificial intelligence to assess maybe how to sell something to somebody on one hand on the commercial side, but on the other side, how to go through a zillion reams of data, many petabytes of data, to gather intelligence and start out intelligence to do battle command and control. The department and the military needs those sorts of technologies in its systems as quickly as it can get them. And that's why we have organizations like DIUX out there trying to find those technologies and be a path to get them in. So there are all of those different pieces need to be thought about when you talk about the industrial base. And they each have their own features, and they each have to be addressed from a policy perspective in their own way.
And one thing I would just add, if you get a chance to dig into the report, we look a little bit at the shape of Canadian industry that participates in the defense marketplace. It's maybe not a shock to a Canadian, but for those of us in the U.S., informative to see that, in essence, Canada's prime contractors are the U.S. prime contractors, essentially the full suite. It's an illustration of just how integrated these markets are, that Canada made a conscious decision basically in the 60s that they could rely on U.S. primes to provide their top-tier defense equipment, and that was okay. And they made that decision to commit to the integration of these markets. We go into that in some detail in the report, so I recommend that you read it. Before I turn to audience questions, I just want to ask one more, kind of on the opportunities. So, and we try to also get into this in the report. We have a series of case studies in different industry sectors and look at where the security interests of the two countries are sharply aligned and the capabilities and the industrial partnership opportunities are presenting themselves. But I'd be interested in the panel's thoughts. I know you've all had a chance to look at the report, but you also have experience in where the countries have been working together in space and cyber and some of these other areas. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on major opportunities that we have that is going to be, as you said, Frank, compelling to senior leadership, a compelling business proposition, a compelling security value proposition for us going forward.
Maybe I'll start on that then. So, I mean, the report actually does do a very good job of sort of setting out some of the key industrial capabilities that Canada has that certainly offers opportunity for more bilateral trade, I think. I mean, Frank mentioned the Arctic earlier. Obviously, you know Canada, we have a lot of snow. So we know how to do Arctic well, and we do a lot of technological R&D around cold water and cold weather type things, but also C4ISR, we have a lot of capabilities in that area. Obviously space, those of you who are familiar with the Canada arm will know Canada is a leader in space robotics, and certainly that arm is a tangible demonstration of that. And then I had mentioned earlier some of the land strength we have around light armored vehicles and those sorts of platforms. So there's a lot of opportunity for areas of natural cooperation. And then I would just supplement that by saying, obviously, Canada also has, thousands and thousands of small, medium enterprises who are all engaged in different levels of innovation and technology. And clearly, as David mentioned, trying to figure out and mine those opportunities to identify companies that may have technologies of benefit to the US DoD is a challenge even for us to keep track of. So there's opportunities in there as well.
Well, the person who knows least about this particular topic will now try not to be foolish, but I certainly think you have to take into consideration first the lines of communications with Canada and its marketplace. We don't have to put it on a ship. We don't have to fly it on an airplane. You can drive it over the border, and we can protect those lines of communications if dire circumstances require. Second, there's a commonality in education and language and in culture. I think all of these things contribute significantly to incorporating businesses into our view of the world. But what's lacking is any real what I observe that is lacking is any real focus in our training of our own program managers and our own science and technology people on looking for solutions from north of the border. And they have good reasons for it. There are ITAR restrictions, there are DEER restrictions, there are security restrictions, there are concerns about dual nationals having access, all these things I think you mentioned in your report. But somehow we have to find a way to meet the challenges of the future, to overcome these barriers, to either reduce them or knock them down so that we can take advantage of a fully integrated approach to the defense of North America, whether it's the Arctic waterways, which the Russians now are boasting that they're going to control both by land, air, and sea, or whether it's missile defense from the Rocket Man, according to our president, or whether it's in the C4SI area.
Kind of going back to my comments about Economics 101, the way a larger economic sphere, if you will, enterprise, seamless enterprise, tends to work is that specialization occurs within it. And I think for Canada, and I don't want to be too direct about this, because at the end of the day, business interests tend to drive this on their own. But specialization in certain areas where you can be the best in class create opportunities, basically. The U.S. traditionally has tried to some degree to do everything in terms of what it does to equip its military. I don't think that's affordable anymore. So we have to look for areas in which other people might be better than we are. And so figuring out, I'm calling them niches, but that may be not a good description, areas in which you can specialize. Arctic technologies, the ability to design for extreme cold environments is another one on the services side. Canada has a very good capability in like ground combat vehicles, which is another area. I think there's some maritime areas which apply, and you mentioned a couple, space and cyber, Martin. So I think some degree of specialization where you can be best in class and be very attractive from a business perspective is probably the right way to go, as opposed to trying to do everything. And then the U.S. on its side has got to be willing to go acquire from that best in class for its own interest, certainly, but for the net interest of both parties.
Great. I'd like to, at this point, offer the opportunity for our audience to ask questions of the panel and join the discussion. So we have folks with microphones in the back. If you have a question, raise your hand, and I'd ask you stand up and just briefly say who you are and ask a question. So.
Doug Berenson with Avocent. I've talked to quite a few Canadian firms who tell a similar story. That is, they've met that program officer or that contracting officer who was enthusiastic about what they had to sell until they found out that they operated from Ontario or Quebec or wherever. And then the conversation took a very different turn. Is it possible to counteract sort of what seems to me to be sort of a deep-seated cultural assumption that one must buy from U.S. sources, even if the regulatory and statutory environment don't really say that. I mean, there's a waiver for the Buy America Act. Almost every sort of rule that you can name has been accepted in Canada's case, is my understanding. But there is this sense at the execution level that we just can't go there. Is that a barrier that can be overcome, or is it so deep seated in the bureaucracy that it's very hard to combat?
I'll comment real quickly. It certainly can be overcome, but it takes leadership, and it takes some political will to do that. I can tell a quick war story. It's kind of amusing. This isn't just true at a national level. This can be true at a very local level as well. 25 odd years ago, I had a program manager come into me who had put out a draft RFP, request for proposal for a weapon system. And he had put into the draft RFP that whoever won would have to open a factory within 50 miles of the city in which he resided. And I said, you will get that out of that RFP immediately. He took it out. Every bidder, nevertheless, put a factory within 50 miles of thing, right? So it takes leadership, but it takes a certain amount of tenacity and attention to detail. But yes, it definitely can be overcome.
Well, certainly one of the things we've observed is that people who don't want to do things find excuses in the regulations and the guidance not to do them, and people who do want to do things figure out how, as one of Mr. Kendall's deputies explained to us in a meeting not long ago, they make the FAR sing. They make it work for them, and they make the regulations sing, and they make it happen. And a lot of that is the leadership that's provided. And I know that Mr. Kendall, while he was in the department, tried very hard and with his directions to folks, telling them that they were empowered, not restrained. But nonetheless, there's a fear, and has nothing to do with your report, but there's an incredible fear of oversight in our federal structure. Our people are afraid that someone's going to criticize them or put them in jail. By the way, we don't send many people to jail. We send some, but not very many, to jail. And most people don't get fired, but they're afraid that's what's going to happen. And as a result, it's easier not to do a waiver of the Buy American Act. It's easier not to go up and ask for a deviation, because our processes right now are scaled to drive you in the other direction. And so I think you'll see us talking about how we change that dynamic, how we reward people for taking a risk. And we also make sure they get the kind of education they need from the various institutions of education we provide inside the Department of Defense and across the government.
I just want to make a comment on that too, because we looked at this in the report. I tend to think about this in terms of transaction costs. Working across the border involves higher transaction costs than executing a contract with a domestic firm, and that's very intentional, actually, in the way the system is set up. But those transaction costs can vary quite a bit. And so one of the things that we found in both our interviews and in our actual data work is, of course, number one, those transaction costs can be overcome, particularly when there's motivation, and that was true with the war surge, and I saw that when I worked for Frank as director of the Joint Rapid Acquisition Cell, that we definitely found the folks who made the FAR sing for those urgent operational needs. And we did a lot of business with foreign firms, including firms in Canada. But we also found that in sort of the more routine aspects of the acquisition system, the program offices that engaged routinely with Canadian firms, transaction costs there were almost zero in terms of the marginal increment for doing business with Canada. This system, which was designed to integrate the industrial bases, in those cases was integrated. And it was almost, no skin off the back in those program offices that are used to doing business with Canada to do it. For a program office that hasn't done it before, that transaction cost may seem like an almost insurmountable barrier. And so one of our focuses there was to figure out how could we lower the transaction costs at some of the program offices where it hasn't been done before. And as Frank said, that takes leadership. I think I saw here in the front.
Hello, my name is Phoebe Kim. I'm a research coordinator at the National Foreign Language Center. So My question is, the panel had talked earlier about how that the evolution of the defense industrial base to more of a global marketplace and reducing barriers to trade. So I assume that as the marketplace expands, there's also increased risks for threats. So I was wondering, can you speak to some of the opportunities available for information and process sharing to block certain threats, particularly cybersecurity threats, and how the U.S. can work or is working with allies, close allies, to increase information sharing, technology research in these areas?
Okay, the question was about in a global marketplace that was discussed by several of us on the panel. You have threats to industry, industrial security, and what opportunities or what efforts are underway to address those threats and secure the supply chain among partners and allies.
I can talk to what we did in the U.S., and I think it's still ongoing. And I think by extension, as we work through U.S. primes or even non-U.S. primes, the rules that we put in place would still apply, and they flow down to suppliers. So in that sense, they flow down internationally. A case in point, I think, for us would be one that I kind of watched it evolve, was F-35 sales to Japan, where Japan had to create an industrial security apparatus, if you will, system that didn't even exist. And they put a pretty big effort in that, and they were able to do it successfully. We're very concerned about protecting the technology that we share with our allies and our partners and that we export. And there are rules that come from that. The cybersecurity threats only get more and more pervasive. I tried to highlight the importance of that by adding a section to our basic acquisition document that covers our acquisition process, specifically on the cybersecurity responsibilities of our program managers and what they need to do to protect their program, including their supply chain, including their design team, including the product itself, including everything that touches one way or another, particularly digitally touches that product. We put in place we did 2 rounds of this actually. We put in place using National Institute of standard for protection of unclassified technical data, because that was one of the areas which we were seeing the biggest problems with theft of that data, basically. So we put some rules in place. We had them in place for a couple of years. We watched that evolve, put a modified set of rules in place, reacted to some concerns about industry, about the burden that was going to put on them to give them a little bit more time to implement them, and then finalize them. So those are out there now and being implemented by industry. And if you're going to participate, and they flow down through the supply chain, so if you're going to participate in the U.S. through a U.S. prime, you're going to have to do that. If you're a non-U.S. prime, you're going to have to comply as well when you participate in that. So I think this is very much a work in progress. I don't think the threat's going to get less, it's going to get worse. I think the commercial world is catching up to the imperative to provide adequate cybersecurity. I have asked people if they think the DoD is more stringent in its requirements for cybersecurity than the commercial world is, and the answer has been generally absolutely. We have, I think, led the way in this to a certain extent. And I think we have not quite gotten to the point where there's been one of my former bosses used to call it a cyber Pearl Harbor. He's thinking more instead of a military attack, but it can be a commercial attack too. The Equifax recent incident, I think, is an example of some of the sorts of things we can be worried about. But almost all of us do all of our financial transactions electronically now. That's a potential vulnerability, and if people start losing enormous amounts of value, I think you'd see a big change. Hurry. I went to a conference 20 years ago with some banks, and they were asked about the degree of security they were providing, and the answer was very chilling to me at the time. I think this is very old data, but it kind of gives you a sense of the difference in how the Department of Defense was looking at this, and how industry, at least at that time, was looking at this. The answer to the question of investments in cybersecurity was that we're all playing Russian roulette. We're waiting for somebody else to have the problem instead of us, and then the government will come in and pay to fix everybody. That hasn't happened yet, okay? And neither the massive attack on an entity, but I think everybody's so interconnected now that, and these threats tend to be often non-institution specific. So anyway, it's a recognized problem. I think the DoD is actually taking some steps in the right direction, but there's much more to be done, no doubt about it.
The only observation I would make in our review of some of these issues, and we're specifically reviewing the cyber rule that DoD issued back year before last, or that was the network penetration and cloud services rule, isn't the requirement to provide the protection through the supply chain. In some cases, it may be the standard. In this particular case, we called out NIST 800-171 SP, or SP, whatever the numbers are, and that is a peculiarly U.S. standard. It is not an international standard. So the problem isn't with insisting on integrity of the supply chain and of the businesses. The problem is finding an outcome measurement which won't discriminate against the ability of great European companies or great East Asian or Pacific Rim companies to compete in our marketplace, because their customers and their environments don't call for the use of the particular standard we may call out. I'm not advocating a UN standard for everything. That's not my ad. But somehow we need to maybe focus our attention on outcome measurements as opposed to particular ways to get there. By the way, we've been told by a number of companies that there's lots of different ways to solve problems. Give us a chance. We may actually save you money and give you better protection.
I don't have a lot to say on this because I'm certainly not the authority on the Canadian government and how we deal with cyber and security, but I'll take a minute to make the plug that one of the advantages of working through CCC, as we do in the US DoD CCC relationship, is all of these transactions are centralized through us, and we understand very well the security requirements and the data management requirements of those products and services going back into DoD. And so we're able to help Canadian firms manage all of that security by understanding those regulations. So those sorts of controls can be put in place in this environment to help address some of the risks that you've pointed out in your question. Thank you.
And I would say in the report, we go into some depth, actually, at the fact that Canada has aligned many of its standards and many of its systems and its regulatory policies with U.S. and to extent well beyond anything anyone else in the world has done, including controlled goods program. And that's one of the benefits to the U.S. of this cooperation over time. I think we have time for one more question here on the aisle.
Thank you. I'm Jennifer Taylor. I work with Dave at the 809 panel. I noticed in a quick skim of the report that you talk a little bit about the reticence of using foreign military sales, and I was hoping you guys might elaborate on that as what potential restrictions are in place that we might be able to take a look at, or what else is causing that sort of hesitancy?
Well, in terms of the report, of course, we're very focused on the U.S.-Canada trade in this report. Elsewhere in our work in the DIG program and at CSIS, we look more broadly at defense trade. And one thing that's very notable, and Frank alluded to this earlier, is that the balance of defense trade is very much in the U.S. favor in almost all cases, in fact, pretty much all cases. And so the aerospace and defense sector of industry is really an all-star in terms of exporting successfully around the world and getting a lot of value for that trade. And in recent years, we've really seen that peaking, and it's looking like 2017 may be the all-time record year for transactions. So there's been a lot of effort put in and spurred on, from my perspective, in large part by what we've been through in the last 10 years, trying to equip the Iraqi security forces and then trying to do it again a second time, trying to equip Afghan security forces, executing on the F-35 program, which was really a vision in the late 1990s and the early 2000s about countries working together. And now you see, in fact, they're producing jets in Italy, and Japan is getting close to having some, I think, roll off the line as well. So it's no longer just a vision. It's really happening. And so there's really been a tremendous growth. And along with that, leadership attention, the outreach to India, which Frank had a huge involvement with, because it was a strategic objective of the administration at that time to deepen that relationship, specifically in the industrial arena. And as a result, you saw a lot of streamlining of process. And a lot of it is literally, blocking and tackling, and to mix metaphors, dotting I's and crossing T's in the bureaucratic process. When you dig down, there's not this big thing that's stopping everything from happening. It's a lot more of kind of this sand in the gears that slows things down. And maybe I'll turn to the real expert to further answer.
There was a lot done in the previous administration to try to improve foreign military sales and export control in general. And I think with some degree of success, but it's still a process that is lengthy and can be uncertain and can be bureaucratically kind of difficult. The things that were done were to try to combine licensing, to combine, to simplify the munitions list and the dual-use list, and so that things can be much more easily approved. We did some things on the technology review side to try to expedite those processes, simplify them, and put an oversight mechanism in place so that if there was something that was stuck, we could push it through the system more quickly. There's a part of the process which has to do with the State Department notifying the Congress and getting licensing, getting approval. So there are a lot of different dimensions to it. I think we've made a lot of progress. I think there's still a lot of room for improvement. And it may be encouraging to you to pass on to you, and I hope I'm not stealing any of her thunder, that I know this is a priority for Ellen Lord. I've talked to her about it, and she's articulated that she, based on her experience in industry, would very much like to take on ways to further streamline that process. So I wish her well in that. She's one of the players, together with the policy side of OSD, together with the State Department and others, that has an influence on that. Overall, people come to the U.S. for our products for two reasons. They're superior products on the first hand, and the second hand, we're very good at supporting them once they're fielded. They come to us in spite of what they have to go through to get those products through the FMS, or even in some cases direct commercial sales when you can do it. And I think as competition grows within the world, it becomes more difficult to overcome those burdens. And I think that's something that we're going to, I think by necessity, have to look at harder in the United States, is try to reduce those burdens, make the process more predictable, and make it easier to do. We have a treaty that we have not really utilized very much with the UK and Australia that was intended to circumvent some of this. I don't think it's been utilized nearly as much as it could be. And I think Canada could be part of that as well. There is an opportunity here, if the administration wants to take it on, to go fundamentally relook at this and fundamentally look at, okay, are the barriers we have in place, particularly for our closest allies, really necessary, given the nature of that relationship? The other piece of it that is important to a lot of our partners, when they build a product that we may buy, which has U.S. content, which then may be limited, is the restriction on their ability to sell that product to third parties. And I ran into this several times in my previous job. That's a real constraint, and it makes it harder for people to do business with us. We have to address that as well. And there are some cases where I think we have basically caused ITAR restrictions to be applicable to products that are of our partners because of U.S. content, which really, to me, defies common sense to a certain extent. But it's there nevertheless, and it's a major impediment. It prevents some cooperative work that I think would really be in everybody's benefit. So work still to be done, some progress made, but a lot of work still to be done.
All right, with that, I think we have come to the end of our time. So I want to thank you in the audience for attending, and our online audience, which I think for this event is fairly substantial, also for tuning in. And I do want to, before we leave, thank the two principal authors of this report, Christina O'Beckney and Greg Sanders, who couldn't be with us right at this moment for this, but they really did the bulk of the work on this report and did a fine job in my view. And please join me in thanking our panelists for an excellent discussion.